Bonjour tout le monde. Before we get started, I want to recognize the great work that all of Team Canada has done ahead of today's United Nations Security Council vote. We're running for the Security Council seat because we saw a unique opportunity to engage with our partners across the UN to build sustainable peace and to make real progress on the issues that matter. Around the world, people want many of the same things: clean air, a real shot at success, a fair economy, and a just society. And to make that happen, we have to work together, today and every day. That is something that our government is ready to do. At the beginning of the year, I don't think anyone could have predicted what the coming months would hold. COVID-19 is truly an unprecedented challenge. And right from the start, it was clear that we needed to put everything we had on the table in response. So that's exactly what our government did. In the space of a few weeks, we introduced the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. We created loans for small businesses and put in place support for specific sectors that have been hardest hit. We rolled out help for seniors, for students, for families. At every step of the way, we kept Canadians up to date about what we were doing to respond. Taken together, we've now introduced the largest economic measures in our lifetimes, measures that are helping millions of people, because that's what the situation demanded. Now, as we begin to safely and gradually restart, I know people are wondering what this pandemic will mean for their jobs in the long run and what the impact has been on our economy and on our path forward. We hear that, and we want to make sure that you have the best information possible. So today, I can announce that in the House of Commons on July 8th, our government will be releasing an economic and fiscal snapshot. This will give Canadians a picture of where our economy is right now, how our response compares to that of other countries, and what we can expect for the months to come. Later today, Minister Morneau will formally announce in Parliament that we will be presenting this economic and fiscal snapshot. Dès le début de la crise, on savait que
At the beginning of the crisis, we knew that COVID-19 would represent an enormous challenge for our country. Our response, therefore, had to take that into account. In a few weeks only, our government has set up a bunch of measures in order to be able to help people navigate through this difficult situation. We created the CERB and the wage subsidy. We have offered business loans to small and medium-sized businesses and targeted support to the sectors that have been most deeply affected by the crises. Whether you are a pensioner or whether you are without a job or a university student, we want to be there to support you. And as the economy starts slowly getting back up again, we want to know what's going to happen over the next few months and what this crisis has meant. And this is why we are announcing today that our government will publish an economic snapshot on July 8th next month at the House of Commons. And this will give us an update on where the economy is and how our response compares to other countries and what we may expect in the next few months. Later on today, Minister Morneau will inform Parliament of this step. Adopting measures in order to nullify the situation is part of the challenge here. We want to work very hard to make sure that all first-line workers in hospitals have all of the necessary equipment. And on that, I have some very good news to share with you. First of all, our government has signed an agreement with Galenus, which is a Montreal-based company, in order to be able to make silica beads, which are essential for screening. And this week, Health Canada has also certified Canadian-made ventilators, respirators, and they're called Ventilators for Canadians. They are now going to be able to increase their production in order to make 20,000 ventilators that have been ordered. 2 years ago, I went to CAE to talk about an investment made for workers, and today we have seen why it is so important to support not only talent but innovation that is homegrown.
Make incredible discoveries every day, from rapid advances in understanding COVID-19 over the last few months to years-long studies of climate change and cancer treatments. It's in everyone's interest that they continue doing their vital work. So today, we're announcing almost $500 million in funding through NSERC's additional annual Discovery Grants program. This money will support thousands of Canadian researchers and their groundbreaking work, whether they're studying viruses, developing AI, or making strides in chemical engineering. Canadians are innovative and creative, and that's something we'll always support. This morning, I want to speak about help for another group of Canadians who do vital work, our fish and seafood producers. The women and men who work on fishing boats and in processing plants keep our families fed. But they've been facing some really tough times lately. That's why, in the next week, we're opening applications for 2 additional programs to support the sector. As of today, the Canadian Fish and Seafood Opportunities Fund is available to help producers access new markets, reach new customers, and maintain a foothold internationally. Canada's seafood is among the best in the world, and this fund will help spread the word. On Monday, processors will also be able to apply for help through the Canadian Seafood Stabilization Fund we created this spring. The fund will provide support for everything from buying PPE to keeping workers safe to purchasing freezers so products stay good while producers find buyers.
Today, we have announced the reopening of the Canadian Fund for Initiative when it comes to fish and seafood. This program will help all fish and seafood producers to be able to access new clients, new markets, and keep an international presence. Monday, processors will also be able to get a financing request in the context of the Seafood Stabilization Fund, which was created a little earlier on this year. It is the kind of support that they will be able to use, amongst other things, to be able to buy PPE, for instance, or to buy things like freezers in order to be able to keep their products if it takes a little longer than normal to find buyers.
On Parks Canada. For a lot of people, no summer is complete without getting the tent packed, the kids in the car, and the time off to go camping. Now, because of the pandemic, many campgrounds had to close temporarily. But the good news is that as of Monday, Parks Canada will gradually start reopening some of their camping sites. No matter what you're planning this summer, whether it's camping or barbecues, keep following public health recommendations and keep doing your part to protect the people around you. Together, we will get through this. Merci.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phones for questions. 1 question, 1 follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Première question, Marie Lastel.
First question, Marie Lastel, Le Devoir. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. I would like to get back to the extension of the CRB that you mentioned yesterday. Several people like François Legault and other trade boards are afraid that this might be a disincentive to work, and they've asked you to modulate things so that people can keep more of their work revenues. You've said that it was an emergency situation and therefore you had to help people rapidly, and which is why you said it shouldn't be modified in terms of conditions. But 3 months later, should we not take the necessary time to adjust the CERB because of this? There are about 3 million Canadians right now who would love to have a job, who have lost their jobs and who cannot find a job. And we know that things are opening up progressively, and there are jobs that have been created or will be created, but nevertheless, there are far too many people who are looking for a job compared to the number of jobs available. We owe it to ourselves to be there to support these people and who need our help and who need the CERB in order to be able to buy groceries and help out their families. Yes, of course, we want to encourage everybody to take any job that is available, but we are far from being in a situation where there are enough jobs for all of those who desire to work, and this is why we have prolonged, we have extended the CERB by an extra 8 weeks. Yes, I understand what you have said, and you've said this several times now for over the last few days, but nevertheless, I don't understand why it is impossible to modify the CRB. Why not make it, put certain conditions to it, adjust it, because there are people who are frauding it. Yesterday, Minister Qualtrough said that you still were intending to impose sanctions on any fraudsters. Can you explain what kind of mechanisms you are going to be using to do this? I think it's important for people to understand that we are in a crisis. And in a crisis like this, we needed to get that money out there quickly with a minimum of verifications with people making their applications. Because of the situation, that the people needed that money very quickly. But like we have said since the very beginning, we will make sure that all of those who are receiving the CERB are not trying to fraud the system. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have already repaid their extra payments that they shouldn't have had, and we know that the system is working. Of course, unfortunately, there is a small number of criminals, of fraudsters, who are taking advantage of the situation, and are by doing this sorts of behavior. But there will be consequences for them. Next question. Next question from Mélanie Marquis from La Presse. The floor is yours. Thank you. Hi, Mr. Trudeau. Last week, you had said that the economic situation was still too unpredictable to give us an economic update. And now you're saying the reverse. What's changed in the space of a week? Well, an economic update would still be an actual economic update would still be unrealistic. I mean, thinking of forecasting of what might be happening between 3 years to 5 years, obviously we are not going to be able to give you those kinds of figures. But every 2 weeks, the Ministry of Finance gives all the information that we are putting forth on all the measures that we're putting forth, and we can still gather all of that data, which is what we are doing, and we're giving certain forecasts of what we might see in the next few months. And this is why we will continue to be transparent and to be open and to give an economic update as to where we're at in the next few weeks and where we might possibly be in the months to come.
Said that an economic and fiscal update would be unrealistic right now because it automatically includes projections for a year, 3 years, 5 years ahead of time, which, quite frankly, we simply couldn't make any responsible predictions about. However, every 2 weeks over the past number of months, we have put forward all the information from finance to the finance committee, to parliamentarians on the measures that we have moved forward on to give a very precise accounting on what we've done. We've continued to do that, and in a few weeks we will gather all that together along with a sense of where we are, comparisons to where we are compared to other countries, and some estimates on where we could be in the coming months. But this will not be an economic and fiscal update. It will be more of a snapshot or a portrait of where we are right now.
Suivi, Mélanie?
Oui, donc si je comprends bien, vous n'irez pas au-delà.
So, if I understand correctly, you're not going to go beyond the next few weeks or months. So we're going to have an idea of up to how long after. Well, the Minister of Finance is working on that, and we want to give the most amount of information possible to Canadians, and we want that information, of course, to be useful. The Minister of Finance will be giving us more details on that matter. Prochaine question. Next question.
Next question. Teresa Wright, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Yes, good morning, Prime Minister. Just following up on what you just said in terms of the fact that you've said that uncertainty makes it impossible to provide a meaningful fiscal update. Given that, what is the value of this fiscal snapshot that's coming in July, given all that uncertainty that we face?
I think it'll be useful for people to see the scale and the details on everything that we have put out. As I've said, we've been keeping the Finance Committee and through them parliamentarians updated every 2 weeks on all the measures we've been flowing out, but at the same time pulling them all together in a look over the past few months on all the measures we've done, comparing the measures we've done in Canada to countries around the world. Some may have done better, some won't have done nearly as much. So we get a sense of where we are compared to others and a sense of what the coming weeks or months could look like. These are things that I think are useful for people to come together on. But because of the transparency we've demonstrated every step of the time, it is a consistent part of what we're continuing to do.
Follow-up, Teresa?
Yes. On another issue, it often takes years for the RCMP to respond to formal recommendations from the Force's civilian watchdog. Is this acceptable to you?
I think one of the things that we've seen come to light over the past weeks and months is that our systems are not adequate to respond to the concerns that racialized Canadians and Indigenous Canadians and others who want to see a reduction of systemic discrimination in our institutions move forward quicker. So we are going to move much quicker on responding to these things, on making changes to our institutions to really go after systemic discrimination. I
think that what we have seen over the last few weeks is that the swiftness with which our institutions have responded as to the needs of making changes, and we know that things have been far too slow, and we will be accelerating things.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Greg Quinn, Market News. Line open.
Hello. Governments in the past have used omnibus bills to put a lot of side legislation into budget packages. When you do present a full budget, will you commit to refraining from using an omnibus bill to put in other measures?
We have been consistent in our approach over the past years of not moving forward with omnibus legislation. These are things that we are fairly strict on. It's something that we saw previous Conservative governments significantly abuse, which is why we made commitments to not have omnibus legislation, and we're going to be sticking with that. We have
seen in the past Conservative governments misuse these kinds of omnibus bills and filled with all kinds of measures that had nothing to do with the specific objectives of the role of the budget. So this is why we are going to be restricting and limiting any extra measures within the bill so that we can have a much better debate within Parliament, and we're going to continue that practice. Thank you.
Yes. The unemployment rate is at a record high, and clearly the CERB program shows millions of people in Canada had savings that weren't enough to last even a couple of months through a time like this. Given the rise in gig employment and tech companies, do we have to take another look at social programs or regulation or taxation of these kinds of gig employers when we get through this tough moment?
I think absolutely, Greg. That's something that we need to look at. We've seen this crisis expose real vulnerabilities within our communities, within our employment systems. We are responding to this emergency right now, but we are also reflecting very carefully on how we can build back better, build back fairer, build back greener, make changes to our systems so that going forward, whether there's another pandemic or some other crises or not, that people are better supported by our systems. We need to make sure that we're doing right by Canadians, and this crisis has given us not just examples of where we haven't been good enough in the past as governments, but opportunities to make significant changes. Okay. Je pense absolument.
I really think that we must examine all of our systems to see what can be improved. I think that this pandemic has shown the cracks within our systems and where they are the most vulnerable. And it's also an opportunity for us to carry out changes, such as rebuilding systems in a country that that it's much more generous and equitable for people, and create thereby more opportunities for everyone else. So if there is other pandemics or more normal times, we need still to do much more for the vulnerable.
You've said July 8th it will be a fiscal snapshot. I'm wondering what specifically it will include, what sorts of numbers, and if this is a means to appease the opposition who've been asking for a fiscal update.
Over the past number of months, we have put forward in full transparency updated numbers every 2 weeks to the Finance Committee on measures that we've put forward. So our commitment to transparency has been ongoing, as has been the case for this government since the very beginning. At the same time, it will be useful to pull together all these different measures so people understand the scale of what this country has done, some comparators with other countries so that they can see where we fit on the spectrum of help to citizens in our peer countries, but also a sense of what could be expected in the coming months. I think it would be a little bit unrealistic to project much further than a few months, because things are changing so rapidly, but we're happy to continue to demonstrate the kind of transparency and accountability that Canadians expect and deserve. I think
it's certainly going to be interesting to see that we can get all this information that we're going to be sharing with the Finance Committee every 2 weeks about our investments, about the different ways that we are sending resources to Canadians. And at the same time, we'll be able to compare ourselves to other countries and see where Canada is, and to see if the kind of help that we're giving compares. And it also gives us an idea of what the next few weeks and the next few months might bring us, without, of course, getting into very long-term forecasting. But it might be a way of reassuring people that we are continuing to be responsible.
Said that you were governing like a king, that you have no respect for Parliament, and you are doing nothing for Quebec. I'd just like to get your response to that.
As we know, this is a minority parliament, so decisions about whether parliament sits and how we move forward need to be made on a consensus or on a majority basis in the parliament, which is why a number of weeks ago we worked with other parties and got an agreement to continue to focus on the COVID-19 crisis, but expand the rules so people could be asking questions on any topics, and ensure that we have accountability moments and times for the parliament to return throughout the summer, including on July 8th, where we'll be presenting a fiscal update. So, 3 different parties came together to make a determination of what Parliament would do. That's how Parliament functions. I can understand that both the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives did not want this particular outcome, but the will of Parliament was expressed by a majority, by the 3 parties who came together to determine what we're doing. That's how Parliament works. And if every time something doesn't go their way, an opposition party cries, "Oh no, it's a dictatorship!" all of a sudden, it's sort of irresponsible, and it undermines, I think, the strength of our democracy that we've been able to show through this crisis, the strength of our institutions that continue to do really important work, not just to help Canadians during this crisis, but to remain accountable and engaged in our democratic processes.
En français, s'il vous plaît.
I think that it is truly important to stress that the situation in Parliament has been debated and has been voted upon by the majority of parliamentarians. 3 parties got together to say, yes, we are going to proceed with an emphasis on COVID-19, but we're going to widen the questions and the issues so that all parliamentarians can ask anything about anything. And we're going to be coming back 4 times this summer, including mid-July, for this economic snapshot that I spoke about. And I think that this is the way that Parliament should work. We're a minority parliament, and no party in particular can decide on its own how things are going to happen. We need to cooperate, and in fact, a majority of parliamentarians align themselves with this approach. Unfortunately, the Bloc Québécois, as well as the Conservatives, were not happy with the result that Parliament gave. They were in the minority. But if every time somebody doesn't get what they want, and if they start yelling that this is a dictatorship, I think that this is somewhat nonsensical. And it might even undermine the kind of trust that people should have in this institution that truly serves our citizens. And we spent a lot of time going over major projects to help all of Canadians, and we have shown the way that we can work and the kind of democratic institutions, how they work, and we continue to reassure Canadians that even during a crisis like this, we can still work perfectly well as a democracy. Philippe Vincent, Radio-Canada, about the UN Security Council seat, you personally have truly invested yourself and a lot of political capital, and we remember what you said. You said Canada is back. But if we lose and if we don't get this, we don't get that non-permanent seat, to what extent will it be your personal fault? For the last 5 years, Canada has more expanded around the world, whether it's from our initiatives in Paris on climate change, or whether it's inside of the G7, or protecting the oceans and the equality between men and women around the world. Our participation has been in many, many issues, and it has shown that Canada has looked for and continues to be profoundly involved, and we want opportunities not only for ourselves but for our allies and the countries who are in the developing world who needs better institutions to serve them during the pandemic and other crises that are yet to come. So Canada is working within this multilateral system and has been doing so really well in the last 5 years. This security seat at the UN is just an extra way for us to ensure the range and to our voices and our actions. And our actions will continue whatever the outcome. And we know that a participatory Canada for the world is good for all Canadians as well. And it is within our interest to have predictable and stable rules around the world. And it is within our interest to know that vulnerable people will be helped to be able to create progress and economic opportunities and educational opportunities for everyone in the world, because Canada will succeed when everyone around the world succeeds. And this is what we've been doing for the last 5 years. This is what we're going to continue to do. And of course, it'll be easier if we are part of the Security Council, but nevertheless, our engaged and participatory approach will not change regardless of the outcome.
We've seen over the past 5 years is Canada has stepped up on the world stage, whether it's been on the fight against climate change through our oceans and through support for small island developing states, as well as climate financing internationally, whether it's been on women, peace and security with our impacts on the new Vancouver Principles on peacekeeping, whether it's moving forward on financing for development with developing countries, looking at our international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods structures that have lasted and kept us so well for 75 years, but need to be modified. Canada has continued to be a strong voice on the world stage because this is what Canada does well, and we will continue to do it. Yes, a seat on the UN Security Council will be an additional lever and an extra way that Canada can make sure that our voice and our values are being heard at the highest levels. But we will continue to make a difference in the world and defend multilateralism, not just because it's good for the world, but because it's good for Canadians. Canadians do well when we are connected to the world, when we are trading with the world, when there are clear rules in place for things like international trade and international behaviors. We do well when countries come together to work collaboratively and respectfully on solving big problems. We do well when vulnerable people around around the world have better opportunities to succeed and fewer conflicts and fewer social inequities. These are the things that Canada has been doing for the past 5 years. These are the things that we will continue to do into the future, regardless of what happens this week. But it certainly would be nice to be able to have that extra lever of a seat on the Security Council.
Je suis pas sûr de comprendre. Là. Je vous demandais est-ce qu'il y a une partie.
I'm not sure I understood. I asked you if it's going to be part of your fault personally if you don't want to answer. But anyway, we know that with the CHSLDs in Quebec, the military will be withdrawing soon. How many people from the Red Cross are going to take over? Do you know? You've told us how important it is to take care of these long-term care homes in Quebec. I can tell you that we have continued to have very fruitful conversations with Quebec, as always, and we will have certain announcements to make very, very shortly.
That you're going to be releasing. If you're doing this, does this mean that the big spending announcements have now all been made? And if not, I mean, how reliable will this be? Also, when do you think you're going to be in a position to actually put forward a fiscal update or a budget?
I think, first of all, we know that we are moving through the emergency phase right now into something that is more of a recovery phase. We will continue to monitor what is needed in the economy as we go forward on extending certain programs, on modifying others. But as we've been doing from the beginning, we will keep adjusting as we go. I think it is useful to bundle together all the initiatives and all the ways we've helped Canadians over the past months in one concrete snapshot in a few weeks. But of course, we recognize that if there is a second wave, if Canadians fall on hard times because of COVID-19 in the coming months, we will need to do more. We are going to remain focused on making sure that Canadians are able to get through this in the best possible way, to be able to keep ourselves and our families safe, but also to be able to make sure we have a strong economy going forward. So, yes, now is a natural time for bundling together everything that we've done with this fiscal snapshot. But certainly as we move forward, we will continue to be transparent about decisions, big and small, we have to take to continue to keep Canadians safe. As for when there would be a full fiscal update or an eventual budget, right now we're still very much responding to an immediate situation, and we will continue to reflect on when that time could be right as the situation stabilizes.
I think quite obviously that we are spending, we are going from an emergency state to one of economic recovery. So it's perfectly logical for us to share with you the kind of measures that we've taken over the last 3 months. But this doesn't mean that we won't have other programs or initiatives to come up with if, for instance, we need to extend certain programs. It is quite logical for us to want to share ideas with you and give you a landscape of where we are. Now, for the next few steps, budgets and more things that are more formal, we will be continuing to examine as to when the situation is stable enough for us to do so. These are ongoing discussions.
Opportunity to answer. How much do you have personally riding on this UN Security Council vote?
I think this is something that Canadians expect for us to be involved in the world, and I've certainly seen the impact that Canada can have on the world stage through the G7, through the G20, through our leadership in multilateral fora at a time where there are large countries sort of withdrawing a little bit from the global stage. I believe deeply that Canada can and should be stepping up on the world stage, and I've demonstrated that Canadians can and do have a large impact on the world when we do that over the past 5 years. I certainly look forward to being able to continue that, and do see that the UN Security Council seat could be a very powerful tool for continuing what we're doing. But as I've said from the beginning, a seat on the UN Security Council is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's a means to continue ensuring that our values, that our voice, and that our solutions are heard and resonating at all levels of multilateralism. Comme j'ai souligné bien souvent,
Like I have said previously, a seat on the UN Security Council is not in and of itself a goal. It's only a way to ensure that the values and the Canadian solutions that we have will be part of the international stage and will continue to resonate around the world. I think that people have seen to what extent Canada has given positivity to the world. And we certainly intend to continue to do this, and it would be easier with a security seat on the UN Council. But whatever the outcome of this vote, nevertheless, we will continue to be present and engaged, because it's good for Canadians to have a more stable world where everyone follows the rules.
Prime Minister, you've listed many things Canada has done internationally on the world stage, but we know that for members, UN members that are voting today on the Security Council seat, two key factors are commitments to peacekeeping and amount of percentage of GDP dedicated to foreign aid. How do you think Canada has done on those two measures compared to the two countries we're competing against?
I think there's always more to do, and we're always looking at how Canada can better help, how Canada can best help on the world stage. But right now, what we're seeing in the world is challenges to the multilateral system, with large countries withdrawing a little bit their support for positive engagement on the world stage. It is a time for medium-sized countries who can have a big voice to step up, and that's why Canada's voice on the UN Security Council could be a strong lever for continuing the defense of the multilateral system we're in and improvements to that multilateral system. I have nothing but respect for our two competitors, Ireland and Norway, that have demonstrated an engagement in the world. There's no question about it, and it is unfortunate that we're in a situation of having to compete against friends for this. But I know that Canada has a particular ability to convene voices from around the world, to move forward in ways that are connected to every country around the world through our diaspora, a voice that is consistent and strong in its values, and is really necessary on the world stage right now. We need to have strong voices that are there to speak for others, not just for themselves, and Canada has consistently done that, and that's why I am optimistic about the process we're in. Je pense que c'est important de souligner à quel point le Canada.
It's important to stress to what extent Canada is bringing its own vision with its diversity, with its international engagement. We're a big enough country to make an important change, but small enough to understand that we can't do things alone. And certainly Norway and Ireland are allied, wonderful countries that have an incredible impact around the world. But Canada has its own particular strengths, and even bigger than the other two countries because of our membership in the G7 and G20 and the Francophonie and the Commonwealth, and our relationship that we have within OPEC and other countries. So we are very present, and we are able to gather people together. We can get many voices together, and we can help other voices who are unfortunately not always heard be heard, because big powers sometimes only worry about themselves.
Open to Canada hosting a hub city for the NHL's return to play, provided they can get agreement from local authorities. But the 14-day quarantine for people crossing the Canada-U.S. border is still a rate-limiting step towards that, and it's the same rule that's kept people from being able to go to family weddings, funerals even. What are you proposing? What are you considering with respect to hockey players? Are you going to consider making them essential workers, or are you going to create some other kind of waiver for them that would allow them to enter the country without the 14-day quarantine?
We will be making announcements around this at the appropriate time, but we're working with local health authorities, provincial health authorities, and the NHL to make sure that regardless of the measures in place, Canadians are kept safe, and our focus is on community safety throughout. There are ways that we can ensure that the principles are respected in a way that makes sense for the NHL, and those are what the conversations are. But we are, as I said, open to making arrangements as long as the principles of keeping Canadians safe, first and foremost, and preventing the spread of COVID-19 are respected. Je pense que même si nous
I
voulons
think
tous
that even
voir,
if we all want to see a little bit of hockey on TV this summer, nevertheless, we have to stay within the principle of protecting all Canadians and stop the COVID-19. And this is why we're working closely with the NHL and provincial authorities and local authorities to come up with measures that will allow the National Hockey League to play, all the while ensuring that at every stage we are not risking the health of Canadians. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hello again, I'm Peter.
The Canadian Press, please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Yes, thank you. My first question is for Minister Freeland on the announcement from the Prime Minister today on the fiscal snapshot. Could you tell us what this snapshot will not include that a proper economic update would?
Thank you for the question, Teresa. Look, I think we all appreciate that we are living in very uncertain times. Uncertain because we can't know for sure what the development of the pandemic will be in Canada, in the world. And therefore, there is a lot of uncertainty around what is going to happen in the Canadian economy and crucially in the global economy, which has such a great impact on us here. A full and formal economic and fiscal update gives predictions that we feel have real weight and credibility for the next year, 2 years out, and 5 years out. And we know that it just wouldn't be responsible to say to Canadians, we have enough certainty to know where things will be in 5 years to give that kind of a full and formal fiscal and economic update. At the same time, we think that it is really important to keep Canadians informed about all the measures our government is taking to support Canadians, to support Canadian businesses, and to support the Canadian economy in this time of real and unprecedented crisis. And so on July 8th, the Finance Minister will share with Parliament an economic and fiscal snapshot that gives details about the measures the government is taking. And we think that that will be a very useful thing to do.
Teresa, follow up.
Yes, thank you. My next question is for Dr. Tam. Could you provide some specifics of what the immunity task force has done so far? And also, with the announcement today that the government has partnered with Abbott Labs, when will the first serology test begin and who will be tested?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the immunity task force, one of the primary objectives is to take representative samples to look at the potential prevalence of the COVID-19 infections in Canada, or the SARS-CoV-2 virus infections in Canada. So that's certainly a really critical aspect of it. So the right now, there had already been a lot of preparatory work done, but I think what is really exciting is, of course, the project or the collaboration with Canadian Blood Services and Quebec, where they've accumulated a large number in the tens of thousands of samples that has been collected to provide the initial testing. I know that the acquisition of the serologic test is actually very rapidly being completed right now, and there should be further news on that very soon. But I'm not sure if Minister Rideau would want to add anything.
Nothing specific except to say that I had a very excellent meeting with the Immunity Task Force chairs last week. They are very excited about the partnership with HEMA Quebec and Canadian Blood Services because it does give them access to a large number of blood samples that can be used quickly to begin the initial survey. They're also working very closely with an Indigenous Advisory Task Force that's a subset of their group to make sure that we understand the specific approach for Indigenous communities, and they're looking at other specific populations as well. The work is progressing incredibly quickly, and I think your question reminds me that we should come back to this room with an update very soon.
Thank you, Minister. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Ryan Tumulty from the National Post. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Yeah, good morning. This question is mostly for Dr. Tam. But we've seen in the U.S. and a couple of U.S. states that opened earlier than Canadian provinces. I'm thinking of California and Florida and a couple of others where they've seen a huge surge in cases in the past week while they've been reopened. I'm wondering if you think perhaps that we're seeing a preview of what might happen in the provinces here that are now starting to reopen, if they're just ahead of the curve, I guess. And if not, what's different about our reopening than those U.S. states?
I think every Chief Medical Officer of Health in Canada is looking at these situations around the world very closely, and myself included. So we do see it, all of these kind of trends, as a warning signal for us, really. Again, reminding Canadians that the virus is still around, very much around in many parts of the world, including the United States, but it's still around actually in some communities in Canada. So I think everyone is moving ahead with the reopening, founded upon the principles that everyone's agreed to, which is to take extremely slow and cautious approach. But that some of the key sort of agreed upon principles upon we work is, first of all, the ability, of course, to be able to detect, test cases, trace the contacts rapidly, isolation and quarantine, as well as we've heard, keeping up with the supplies for the healthcare system, human resource, as well as the public health capacity. So, and of course, the very careful look at what we do about our international borders. So keeping up with the mitigation and reduction of importations through the Quarantine Act and the 14-day required quarantine period are really measures that we are continuing at this time. But I think every time we meet, which is very, very frequently with the province territories, people are sharing some of the lessons learned, looking very carefully at some of the clusters, if you like, outbreaks that have occurred. But as you've seen from the different provinces and territories, when cases have occurred, they've been rapidly moving in to investigate and address those. And so I think whether it's, New Brunswick, British Columbia having some cases, they are rapidly moving in using that kind of strategy. But I think it really is a warning signal, just to remind everybody, as a reminder that we can't let go of these measures and some of the key sustained measures that every one of us has to maintain is the broken record that I've just said earlier on, basically. We need to keep up. And the moment we let go, this virus could find some way of accelerating in our community.
Ryan, follow up?
Is that what you think then is happening in these U.S. states that are seeing? I mean, they're seeing cases higher than they have seen in any point during the pandemic, threefold higher than what they've seen during any point in the pandemic. Is that what you think is happening there then? That they aren't investigating quickly, or they don't have enough basic measures in place?
It's Minister Rideau. I'll just say that it's very different to compare country by country situations because systems are different. And for example, in Canada, we have a public health care system, which means that people can get access to health care free of charge, and they have supports such as the newly extended CERB to be able to take time off if they're ill and isolate properly. And I think it's very difficult to apply what's happening in one country to another. Having said that, I think I said to Dr. Tam today that I was not going to provide opening remarks in fear of repeating what she would say, but she reminded me that it's never a bad idea to repeat how important it is that people continue to be very vigilant in protecting the health, their own health and the health of the people that they love. Because it's not in your community doesn't mean that it's not going to be in your community or that that you're not at risk. We have to continue to wash our hands, to maintain our physical distancing, to avoid crowded spaces. If we are going to meet one another, to choose an outside space, and listen to the advice of local public health, because that is what will help make sure that we protect ourselves and reduce our own risk and the risk to the people around us.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now turn to the room. Ian, Ashley. We'll start with Ian Woods from CTV.
Ian Woods, CTV News. Minister Freeland, can you tell us why it's important for Canada to have a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations?
It's important for Canada and it's important for the world. I think we all recognize that the world is at a real hinge moment, a time when Canada and all countries in the world are facing some profound and unprecedented challenges. The coronavirus is obviously such a challenge. So is climate change. And even as we are facing these profound, truly global challenges, we are also living through a time when the rules-based international order that was founded after the Second World War is under a great deal of stress. At a time like this, it is so important for Canadians, for Canada to play a role in supporting that rules-based international order, in supporting multilateralism, and in making it fit for purpose for the 21st century, and in bringing to that effort the principles and the values that Canadians and our government champion. Principles like feminism, principles like fighting climate change, principles like supporting human rights, principles like the real value, really the preeminent value of international collaboration. And so I am absolutely convinced that having Canada at the table at the UN Security Council can be really, really valuable to every Canadian. And I think it would be a great thing for everyone in the world. And so for all those permanent reps at the UN, if you haven't voted yet, I strongly encourage you to back Canada.
Forgive me, Ian. Madame la vice-première ministre, on me demande si vous pouvez répéter cette réponse en français, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, bien sûr.
Alors, je pense que c'est évident pour tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes qu'aujourd'hui, c'est un moment très difficile pour le monde. C'est un moment quand on fait face aux défis sans précédent, défis vraiment globaux, les défis comme la pandémie du coronavirus, défis comme le changement climatique. Et ces défis sont par leur nature globale. On peut se battre contre ces défis seulement en travaillant ensemble. Pour cette raison, c'est plus important que jamais pour le Canada d'avoir une voix forte à l'échelle internationale. Parce que le Canada était toujours une des leaders mondiales du multilatéralisme. Et je pense que le monde aujourd'hui a plus besoin que jamais des principes, des valeurs canadiennes, des principes comme le féminisme, des principes comme la valeur des droits humains, des principes comme l'importance de la diversité, d'égalité de tous les gens du monde, des principes comme l'importance de la lutte contre le changement climatique et en bout de ligne des principes comme l'importance du travail multilatéral. Et c'est pour cette raison que je suis absolument convaincue que ce sera une très bonne chose pour tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes et vraiment pour tous les gens d'avoir le Canada au sein du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Alors, si il y a des représentants permanents dans les Nations Unies qui nous écoutent maintenant, je vous encourage chaleureusement d'appuyer le Canada. Merci.
Thank you.
And should Canada not obtain a seat on the Council today, what does that say of our efforts that we've made globally?
I think you always have to go into these things convinced that your cause is the right one and convinced that you will prevail, and that's our attitude.
Ashley?
Ashley Burke, CBC News. Dr. Tam, the Prime Minister of Barbados has written a letter to Canada's Prime Minister. It's on behalf of all Caribbean states, and it's asking that Canadian health officials start talking about traveling. Are you considering this? Will you allow Canadians to travel to destinations like Barbados soon? And what would it take for that to happen?
So we have provided travel advice for Canadians to avoid non-essential travel, essentially, to anywhere outside of Canada, essentially, at this point, and that is our current advice. Of course, we'll evaluate things on an ongoing basis. We do know that as other countries are opening up, there's every possibility the Canadians will travel more, and but of course, if they do that, they need to be fully cognizant of what that risk is. And when they come back to Canada, they are subjected to a mandatory 14-day quarantine, and that stays. But I, do know that people are very much interested in what some of the next steps might be, but I don't know if our ministers would want to comment.
I'd like to add one thing just to make precise the question. Canadians are not forbidden from leaving the country. Canada is an open society. We're a democracy. Canadians are free to leave, and all Canadians outside Canada are always free to return home. The public health advice we've just heard from Dr. Tam about avoiding non-essential travel outside Canada is still in place, and it's there for a very good reason, and I encourage us all to listen carefully to the advice of our public health authorities. And as Dr. Tam said, to protect ourselves, to protect our families, and to protect our neighbors, if for any reason we need to travel outside the country, all of us, Canadians and anyone else coming to Canada, will be subject to a mandatory 14-day quarantine order.
And Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, the United States Trade Representative says that the U.S. will swiftly launch trade action if Canada's dairy industry does what it calls shading, so interpreting the quota rules in a way that discriminates against Americans. What's your response to that claim, and what steps is the Canadian government taking to satisfy those concerns?
Canada and the United States have the world's deepest and I would say most successful trading relationship. And both countries are very effective in defending our own national interest. That's one of the reasons I am so glad that Chapter 19 still exists, a very, very important provision in NAFTA. I'm also very glad that in the new NAFTA, we've been able to set up much stronger state-to-state dispute settlement mechanisms. When it comes to the new NAFTA, Canada is a country that is an ardent and effective trader and trading partner. We are good at following the rules, and we believe in doing that. And we're also good at standing up our national interest, and we'll do that too.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Operator will go back to the phone for two last questions. Over to you.
Merci. Thank you. The next question is from May Warren from the Toronto Star. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Yes, this question is for Dr. Tam. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the new study out of Britain on dexamethasone and what your recommendation would be for Canadian doctors and COVID-19 patients about whether they should be using this drug in their treatment.
Yes, thank you for the question. We are, of course, looking at every kind of treatment that might be helpful in the treatment of patients with COVID-19. Just to clarify that what was publicly communicated was that dexamethasone, which is a glucocorticoid or a steroid drug, had a positive impact on severely ill patients. They didn't have impact on people who were mildly ill. So this is for people who are on a ventilator or may need quite significant supportive care on oxygen, etc. So we're looking forward to the data as it is being published, and we'll review this very rapidly with a number of clinical care networks, which includes the Canadian Critical Care Society, the Association of Medical Microbiologists and Infectious Disease Canada, as they are the clinical experts. And now this medication is actually something that is used in the medical care system already for people who have an inflammatory illness. And some people in the ICU are being treated with dexamethasone for certain conditions. So I think that this is an important study, and we absolutely will review the published data as fast as possible.
Follow up?
Yes, and so I appreciate the need to see the data. But if someone wants it right now, what would the recommendation be for that? Would it just be wait and see or case-by-case basis?
Yeah, so in Canada, as I said, this drug is available. It is normally used in different settings in the hospital setting, and clinicians always have the ability to exercise clinical judgment.
Thank you, Dr. Tam.
Okay, thank you.
Operator, last question, please.
Thank you. The next question is from Lina Dib, La Presse Canadienne. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour, Madame Phelan. Je voudrais d'abord une question à vous au sujet de la situation des militaires, les CHSLD. Je voudrais savoir où en sont exactement les négociations. M. Trudeau tout à l'heure a dit qu'on annoncerait les choses quand on les annoncera, mais à ce que je comprends, les militaires sont en train de se préparer à partir. La Croix-Rouge n'aura pas embauché 1000 personnes d'ici le 26 juin, qui est la date prévue du départ des militaires. Alors, vous en êtes où exactement?
Merci pour la question, Lina. Je veux souligner quelque chose. Premièrement, je veux encore une fois remercier les excellentes forces armées canadiennes qui font un travail extraordinaire au Québec et en Ontario. Et je pense que tous les pays doivent être reconnaissants de l'importance de ce travail et du sacrifice que les gens des forces armées canadiennes font. Concernant nos discussions avec le Québec, comme le Premier ministre a dit, nous sommes en train de discuter avec le Québec à l'avenir, les prochaines étapes dans les CHSLD du Québec. Et je veux souligner que le soutien critique continuera. Nous comprenons l'importance de cet enjeu, nous comprenons l'importance d'aider et d'appuyer nos aînés. Et je suis convaincue qu'en étroite collaboration avec le Québec, ce sera possible de trouver un plan pour l'avenir.
Lina, poursuivi.
for the future.
Oui, merci.
Follow-up question?
Dr. Tam, I was wondering if we could go back to the percentage of positive tests. You say Quebec has never been so low, about 3%. You're reporting just a little over 1% of positive tests in all of Canada. So I wonder, what do you read in those numbers? Well, what is there to understand? Because you had said at some point, the more we'll test, the smaller the percentage will get. But is this telling you anything about the evolution of the epidemic in Canada?
Yes, so of course it's one indicator and it has to be interpreted with all other indicators. So we know that the number of cases are falling in Canada despite increasing number of tests in Canada. And also the hospitalizations, the ICU admissions, all of these indicators have been trending downwards and actually quite rapidly in the last days. And so I think this indicator, which is the percentage of lab positive tests, which is over the total number of tests taken, is trending down as well, which is a good sign. I think it goes along with the fact that this initial wave of the pandemic is, with the collective action of everybody, is coming under control. And so the percentage of tests also gives us an idea of whether we're testing in the right place, on the right populations at the right time, as the pandemic rolls along. So at the height of a pandemic, we might expect like a 10% positive as being quite good in terms of the fact that the tests being done are targeting the right population. As we come down this side of the epidemic curve, what we have to watch for is actually when it gets really, really low, is to examine those positive cases to see if they're indeed cases or whether they're actually false positive cases. So we might come across some of those as well if that percentage goes quite further down. Provinces and territories that have had less than 1% positive are very much cognizant of this phenomena, and they will be investigating every case and lab positive to further understand them and further understand the performance of our tests.
It's Dr. New here. Maybe add to that in the Quebec context. The 3% is overall for Quebec, but obviously even in Quebec, I think that's why I didn't really get into the details. You need to look at what's happening at a very local level, because obviously what's happening in Montreal is completely different from what's been happening in the rest of the province of Quebec. So I think, rather than even taking, quote, a general overall percentage, I think you need to drill down, as they say in English, in terms of what is the sort of positive test rate in Montreal compared to other regions of Quebec. And that's obviously guided, I think, officials in Quebec in terms of how they've been relaxing certain measures in sort of a staged way, maybe region by region. Montreal, I think, being a bit delayed compared to the rest of Quebec. So I think it's important to look forward to see how those measures are being implemented, what the results are, and keep track of the testing approach in the specific parts of Quebec rather than maybe just Quebec as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.
This concludes the press conference. Thank you.